Bedford Hollow, Michigan. A place most people had never heard of. Just a dot on the map between farm towns and forests, the kind of place where time seemed to move slower. It was the kind of town where people waved from porches, where the biggest news was usually who won the Friday night football game. But in the spring of 1991, something happened that would stain that quiet place forever. Elaine Wexler had lived in Bedford Hollow her whole life. She was a high school literature teacher, respected, kind, and always the first to volunteer for parent-teacher nights or bake sales. People described her as soft-spoken, thoughtful, and endlessly patient. But behind her calm exterior, Elaine had been living in a long, slow nightmare. She was married to Harold Wexler, a local accountant known for his meticulous work and cold demeanor. For years, Harold had controlled every detail of Elaine's life. What she wore, where she went, how she spent money. He wasn't violent, at least not in the beginning. His abuse was quieter, emotional, psychological, the kind that breaks someone down piece by piece. They had 3 children together. Elaine had stayed for them, for years, telling herself things might change. But things didn't change. Harold only grew colder. After 17 years of marriage, Elaine filed for divorce. It was messy. Harold contested everything, the custody, the house, even the pet dog. But a judge granted Elaine primary custody, with Harold allowed visitation every other weekend. Elaine wasn't happy about it. Neither were the kids. Easter Sunday, March 31st, 1991. The sun was shining. Elaine had made breakfast. Her youngest daughter, Abby, had colored eggs the night before. They were all still in their pajamas when the knock came at the door. It was Harold. He wasn't supposed to arrive for another hour. Elaine opened the door reluctantly. He stood there, rigid in his dark slacks and tucked-in shirt, arms crossed. She stepped outside and closed the door behind her. They spoke in hushed voices. No one knows exactly what was said, but it didn't take long before the voices grew louder. The children watched through the window. They say their father grabbed Elaine's arm. She pulled away. He shouted something. Then Elaine turned toward the door, but she never made it back inside. Harold shoved her hard. She stumbled, lost her footing on the concrete steps, and tumbled down onto the gravel driveway. She lay there motionless. The children screamed. Harold rushed to her side, panicked. He touched her face, then looked up and saw the kids watching. "She's fine," he said. "She's going to the hospital." He picked up Elaine, carried her limp body to his brown panel van parked at the curb, and threw open the back doors. One of the kids, 13-year-old Mason, ran to the phone and called 911. "My dad. He hurt my mom," Mason told the dispatcher. "He's taking her. He said he's going to the hospital, but I don't think he is." But by the time officers arrived at the house, Harold and Elaine were gone. Just a few drops of blood on the driveway. No one knew where they were headed. About an hour later, on a 2-lane country road about 40 miles from Bedford Hollow, a young couple named Gary and Tina Long were taking a Sunday drive. They were just out for a ride, enjoying the open sky and quiet roads. That's when a brown panel van suddenly came flying up behind them. It was right on their bumper. No turn signal, no warning. Just this aggressive, beat-up vehicle that swerved and sped past them. Tina turned to Gary and said, "Geez, what's his hurry?" A few miles later, the Longs spotted something strange. Off the side of the road, near an old, boarded-up grain mill, they saw that same van parked near the tree line. A man stood outside the open rear doors, struggling with something large and bundled in what looked like a stained bedsheet. Gary slowed the car. "Is that blood?" Tina asked. Neither of them wanted to find out. They kept driving, but something felt wrong. Very wrong. Less than 10 minutes later, that same van was back behind them. This time it wasn't speeding. It was tailing them. Every turn they made, it followed. When they pulled off onto a side road, so did the van. When they accelerated, so did he. Gary and Tina began to panic. They eventually pulled into a gas station and made sure they weren't being followed anymore. But both of them knew they had seen something they couldn't ignore. And it wouldn't take long before police connected their story with the call from Mason Wexler earlier that morning. Back in Bedford Hollow, police were knocking on doors. They went to Harold's house, empty. They tried his office. Nothing. It was as if he'd vanished. A statewide alert was issued for Harold Wexler and his vehicle. But by that night, he was gone. Elaine's family feared the worst. And they were right to. Because the next day, a Department of Transportation worker mowing grass along Route 72 spotted what he thought was a deer carcass. When he got closer, he realized it wasn't an animal at all. It was the body of a woman, partially hidden behind a ditch and covered in a bloodied blanket. It was Elaine. She had been shot once in the back of the head. The coroner would later determine the wound was inflicted at close range, likely in the back of the van. There were no witnesses.
No camera footage.
And Harold Wexler was now officially a fugitive. But this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of a strange and disturbing trail that Harold would leave behind. In letters, sightings, and clues that would puzzle investigators and haunt Elaine's family for years. And it would all begin with a single postmark. By the next morning, the entire county was on high alert. Elaine Wexler's murder sent shockwaves through Bedford Hollow. Not because people thought Harold was incapable of violence, but because no one believed it would ever go that far. But the truth was, Elaine had been afraid. Afraid enough to file a restraining order once before. Afraid enough to tell her sister, just weeks before her death, "If anything happens to me, don't assume it was an accident." Now, her body had been found dumped off a service road like garbage. And her killer, her ex-husband, was gone. Law enforcement cast a wide net. State police, sheriff's deputies, and eventually the FBI got involved. They had the make and model of Harold's brown 1980s Dodge Ram van. They had a general timeline. And they had the tip from Gary and Tina Long, the couple who saw the van on South Hollow Road near the old grain mill. The Longs came in to give a full statement. Tina was especially shaken. "I saw him," she told investigators. "He had something in a sheet. It was sagging in his arms, like dead weight. I didn't want to believe it was a person. I just thought, that's blood. I know that's blood." The authorities visited the site near the mill. It was secluded, surrounded by trees and tall grass. Deep tire tracks led to a clearing by the silo, but by the time police arrived, there was nothing left but some disturbed soil, a few torn cloth fibers, and a trail of blood that disappeared into the brush. Harold had tried to hide her there, or maybe dump the evidence. But something must have gone wrong. Maybe he panicked, maybe a car passed by and he fled. Either way, Elaine's body hadn't ended up there. Instead, he'd driven 12 more miles west and dumped her like roadkill beside Route 72. This detail puzzled detectives. Harold was meticulous, obsessive. He planned everything. So why choose such a careless, exposed place to leave the body? The answer would come weeks later in the form of a letter. It arrived at Elaine's sister's home, postmarked from Wichita, Kansas. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper, typed, not signed. It read, "When a man loses his family, he loses the anchor of his soul. No court, no woman, no system of law can understand the burden placed on a man who is told he's no longer welcome in his own home. I tried. God knows I tried. But she turned them against me. I only wanted to fix what was broken. But broken things don't want repair. They want escape." Investigators were stunned. The letter didn't threaten. It didn't confess directly. But it reeked of guilt, and more importantly, it sounded just like Harold. They contacted the post office in Wichita. No luck, just a generic Dropbox. But it meant Harold was on the move. He hadn't gone into hiding nearby. He was traveling. Interstate. Over the next 3 months, 7 more letters were sent to various people in Elaine's life. A former colleague, a childhood friend, her pastor. All of them postmarked from different cities. Tulsa, St. Louis,
Baton Rouge,
Little Rock. None with a return address. None with fingerprints. But the content grew darker. "I see now the world is blind. It would rather paint a man a villain than ask why he broke. They crucify a father who only wanted to hold his family together. But what does it matter now? She's gone. I'm gone. Let them make their judgments." The media got wind of the story. A local TV station did a segment, Killer on the Run, the Harold Wexler letters. The case started to gain national traction. And that's when it hit Unsolved Crimes Weekly, a nationally broadcast investigative series known for airing high-profile cold cases. They reached out to local police, to Elaine's sister, even to the Longs. They wanted to recreate the events of Easter Sunday, using actors, for a special episode titled Vanished Justice. The episode aired on September 14, 1991. Millions watched. Viewers were encouraged to call in with tips if they had seen Harold or the van. The show received over 1,200 calls within the first 48 hours. Most were false leads. But one came from a woman in Arlington, Texas. She said she had been dating a man named Harry Quinn for nearly 6 months. He was quiet, polite, worked odd jobs. She had seen him watching the broadcast. She said, "He didn't react. He just stared at the screen, then stood up and said he needed to go. That's when I got scared." She called the police immediately. By the time they reached the address she gave, Harold was already gone. But he hadn't made it far. Just outside Shreveport, Louisiana, a state trooper spotted a brown van that matched the alert. He attempted to pull it over. The van took off. What followed was a high-speed chase across 2 counties, ending in a roadblock near a wooded area. As officers approached the vehicle, they found Harold Wexler slumped over the steering wheel. A single gunshot wound under his chin. The weapon was on the seat next to him. He was dead. Inside the van, investigators found a few clothes, canned food, cash in an envelope, and a stack of typed letters, dozens of them. Most were never mailed. Some were confessions. Some were rants. But one, folded and sealed, was addressed to his children. The forensic team spent nearly 3 hours combing through the brown van where Harold Wexler took his own life. The interior was filthy, cluttered with fast food wrappers, receipts, a few photos of his children tucked into the glove box. But it was the box of letters under the passenger seat that held the key to understanding the storm inside Harold's mind, and how long he had been planning everything. The letters were dated weeks before Easter Sunday. One read, "They think I'm going to disappear quietly. They think I'll let a judge take my children away and hand them to someone who mocks me in front of them. I won't. God didn't put me on this earth to be humiliated. If I can't have peace, neither will she." They found maps with hand-drawn routes, multiple states, rest areas marked in red pen. He had mapped out where to hide, where to send letters, and where to die. It was clear now. Elaine's murder wasn't spontaneous rage. It was premeditated. Harold had waited for the day he knew she'd be vulnerable, Easter Sunday, when she'd be home, relaxed, unaware. And he used that moment to destroy everything. But one envelope stood out. It was sealed, handwritten, and addressed to all 3 children. It read, "To my kids. I hope someday you understand what happened. I never wanted to hurt your mother. I wanted to save her. But she gave up on us. On me. And I couldn't live in a world where you were taught to hate your own father. Remember, I loved you more than life. I always will. I'll be watching from somewhere better." The letter was never delivered. Police kept it as evidence. The children never wanted to read it. What followed Harold's death was a strange calm. The manhunt was over. The body was found. Case closed, technically. But for the town of Bedford Hollow, and for Elaine's family, closure remained elusive. Elaine's funeral was small. Her family could barely afford a marker. She was buried in a simple plot near her parents. No headstone for over a year. Just grass and a metal tag with her name. At the school where she taught, students placed flowers on her desk. Her classroom sat empty for the rest of the semester. But the wounds went deeper than grief. People in town began to question themselves. How had no one seen the signs? How had such a calculated predator lived among them for so long, hiding behind a smile and a pressed shirt? Some whispered that Elaine should have left earlier. Others said the courts failed her. But the truth was simpler and more brutal. Harold had planned everything, and no one, not the kids, not the police, not even Elaine, could have predicted how far he would go. The state reviewed the custody process. Elaine's lawyer gave interviews, warning others about the warning signs she'd seen in Harold. He didn't raise his voice, she said, but every word was ice. The Thornton couple, Gary and Tina, were recognized as heroes. Their testimony had helped police narrow down the timeline, the location, even the van. But they didn't feel heroic. "We just saw something awful," Gary said. "We saw death being hidden in plain sight. And we almost didn't say anything. What if we had just kept driving?" But even after Harold's suicide, the letters didn't stop. 3 months later, Elaine's pastor received another envelope. Same type, same typing, but postmarked after Harold's death. It said, "The world is full of ghosts. Not all of them are dead. Some just linger, because no one's willing to admit they were wrong." The letter was chilling. Investigators believed it had been written earlier and sent by someone else, maybe a sympathizer or someone Harold had entrusted. But to this day, no one knows who mailed it. The Wexler children grew up carrying the trauma of that day. Mason, the oldest, would later describe his childhood as split in two. Before the van and after the van. Abby, the youngest, refused to speak about her father for years. But the town remembered. Every Easter Sunday, someone placed lilies at the old school entrance where the van was first spotted. No one ever saw who did it. And every year, one question lingered in the silence. What if they had stopped him sooner?